She thought towing my car would teach me a lesson. She didn't expect the street itself to fight back. Karen, the neighborhood HOA president, had a reputation that preceded her like a storm cloud waiting to burst. She wasn't just a stickler for rules. She thrived on them, wielding every regulation as a weapon, a way to assert dominance over anyone who dared live in her meticulously controlled neighborhood. Every resident knew her name, either whispered in frustration or muttered in fear. She had an uncanny ability to appear calm and friendly during board meetings while simultaneously plotting ways to assert her authority over the smallest of infractions. She loved rules more than people, control more than fairness, and power more than common sense. No one could recall a single time she had shown genuine empathy or concern for anyone's well-being, unless it aligned with her vision of order. Her tenure as HOA president had lasted longer than most could remember, and she had quietly accumulated influence, alliances, and a near-absolute sense of entitlement. That morning had begun like any other. I had returned from a grueling 12-hour shift, muscles aching, mind heavy with stress, longing only for the comfort of home and the quiet solace of my property. I parked my car in my usual spot in front of my house, the soft hum of the engine fatting as I unlocked the front door, expecting nothing more than a peaceful evening. Yet, as I reached for the handle, my eye caught the bright orange notice plastered across the windshield. My stomach sank, a strange mix of confusion and irritation bubbling up. I picked it up, scanning the official-looking text that immediately set my blood pressure rising. This vehicle has been towed for violation of HOA regulations. Please contact the HOA office immediately. My hands tightened around the paper. Violation? What violation? My car had been parked there for years without issue, never once obstructing anyone, never once causing a complaint. And yet here it was, towed, seemingly as an exercise of power rather than any legitimate concern. I felt a familiar surge of anger, the kind that comes not from the infraction itself but from the audacity behind it. It wasn't just the towing. It was the principle. Karen had decided, unilaterally and without warning, that she had the right to flex her authority, to remind everyone that she was in control and that dissent or casual independence would not be tolerated. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move, the kind only someone who truly enjoyed exerting dominance could orchestrate. My mind raced. I thought of every interaction I had ever had with her, the subtle snubs during community meetings, the exaggerated sighs whenever I questioned her decisions, the way she would linger just long enough in front of my house to make her presence known, a silent reminder that she was watching, judging, deciding. And now this. My car gone, my evening ruined, a financial hit imposed without justification. I felt the fire of determination ignite within me. I would not simply pay the towing fees, bow my head, and accept her tyranny. Number Karen might have power on paper, might have her little empire of bylaws and restrictions, but she had underestimated something crucial. I knew my rights, I knew the laws, and I knew that her obsession with control had made her careless. She had become predictable. She had become reckless. And I was about to remind her, in a way she would never forget, that authority without accountability was fragile, temporary, and easily challenged. I immediately pulled out my phone and called the towing company, my voice steady but sharp, asking for the details of who authorized the tow, at what time, and under what clause. They responded with the usual corporate politeness, reading off the paperwork, but I could detect a slight hesitation when I mentioned the HOA and the neighborhood. The implication was clear. They were merely following orders, no questions asked. But I would question everything. I spent the next few hours digging through HOA bylaws, researching parking regulations, municipal codes, and even historical precedents for such actions. Every word, every line, every clause became a weapon in my mind. Karen thought she could intimidate me with her official actions, but she had forgotten that knowledge, preparation, and strategy often trumped arbitrary authority. As I researched, I uncovered a pattern, an unsettling consistency in her behavior. Other residents had quietly grumbled, sometimes paid fines they didn't owe, sometimes moved cars they had no reason to move, all out of fear of her wrath. And yet there were gaps, loopholes, legal ambiguities that her arrogance had blinded her to. My pulse quickened as the possibilities unfolded. I realized that this wasn't just about my car. This was about sending a message, about asserting that no one, no matter how meticulously they cloaked their ego in rules, could dominate my life without consequence. And I would do it strategically, subtly, and perfectly, in a way that would leave an impression not just on Karen, but on the entire neighborhood. I began to envision the sequence of events, small acts that would compound into a revelation, exposing her obsession with control and the fragility behind her facade of power. I imagined the tension as neighbors observed the unraveling, the disbelief in their eyes as they realized the extent of her overreach, and the satisfaction of knowing that the very thing she prided herself on, her dominance, would become her undoing. That night, sleep was elusive. My mind was alive with possibilities, strategies, and contingencies. I replayed every interaction I had had with Karen, every slight, every overreach, every infraction she had imposed without justification. And with each memory, my plan became clearer. This wasn't a petty revenge. This was a reclamation of balance, a restoration of order, not her order, not the order imposed by fear, but the natural order where power had limits and authority had accountability. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan forming in my mind, a sequence of moves that would not only recover my car, but also shift the balance of power in the neighborhood. Karen might have thought she ruled with an iron fist, but I would demonstrate that her reign had cracks, and those cracks were about to widen. I checked the notice one more time, my fingers brushing the bold letters, the official stamps, the threat implied within the text. I smiled faintly, a mixture of amusement and determination. Let her think she had won this battle. The real war was just beginning, and I intended to fight it smart, precise, and mercilessly, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind that authority alone could never replace justice, knowledge, or ingenuity. The infamous HOA president, Karen, had made her first mistake in targeting me. Little did she know, the towing of my car had awakened a storm, quiet but unstoppable, one that would ripple through her carefully constructed world and expose the weaknesses she had ignored in her hunger for control. And I was ready. I tried to reason with Karen. "You can't just tow cars without proper notice," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm, hopping to appeal to whatever shred of fairness she might have left buried under her ego. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing, as if the very act of me speaking had inconvenienced her. "Rules are rules," she replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "Pay the fine." That smirk, that arrogance, it wasn't just annoyance. It was a declaration of power, a statement that she could dictate the lives of everyone in the neighborhood without question. I had heard stories, of course, about Karen's obsession with control, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The woman treated the HOA not as a service organization but as her personal fiefdom, and anyone who dared to challenge her would quickly learn the consequences. I had parked legally, followed every regulation, and yet my car had vanished. And that vanishing was not just about inconvenience. It was about sending a message, a warning that no one could defy her authority. I clenched my fists, swallowing my immediate frustration. Yelling or reacting impulsively would only play into her hands. She thrived on people losing their composure. Instead, I studied her, nodding the way she stood with one hand on her hip, the other casually holding a clipboard, like a general surveying the battlefield. Her posture was perfect, exuding confidence, but there was a rigidity to it, a faint tremor in her right hand when she thought no one was looking. That small detail, almost imperceptible, told me more than any complaint form ever could. Karen's authority was a shield built on insecurity. I realized then that this wasn't just about my car. This was about territory, ego, and the illusion of control she clung to desperately. Every interaction I'd had with her, every overheard comment at board meetings, every neighbor whispering behind closed doors, they all pointed to the same truth. Karen didn't just enforce rules, she weaponized them. I knew I couldn't let this slide. The fines, the notices, the intimidation. It was all a part of a game I had no intention of playing blindly. So I started thinking, really thinking about leverage, strategy, and timing. There had to be a way to turn the tables, to make her realize that her authority had limits, invisible lines she wasn't allowed to cross. I remembered the property records I'd glanced at years ago, the parcels, the trusts, the obscure ownership clauses that most people ignored. Quietly, meticulously, I began to map everything in my head, which properties Karen lived near, the easements, the access roads, even the water rights that ran beneath her precious lawns. Knowledge, I realized, was power, and I intended to use it wisely. I spent the evening after the confrontation packing my living room, sketching notes on scrap paper, mentally rehearsing scenarios. If she escalated, I needed contingency plans. If she retaliated, I needed preemptive measures. The more I thought, the more I realized how much the neighborhood depended on appearances, gossip, and fear. Karen's power was fragile. It was loud, flashy, and visible, but fragile. All it would take was a calculated move, the right domino, and the whole structure of her control could crumble. That night I couldn't sleep, not because of worry, but because my mind was alive with possibilities. I pictured her reaction when confronted not with anger, but with facts, with leverage, with an undeniable demonstration that her reign was not absolute. I imagined the creeping doubt that would slowly replace her smug confidence, the paranoia that would twist her every decision, every interaction, until she second-guessed herself at every turn. I thought about the neighbors too, the silent witnesses to her little tyrannies, the ones who complained quietly, endured quietly, and yet had never seen anyone push back. They would notice. They would pay attention. Perhaps if I executed this carefully, it wouldn't just be a lesson for Karen. It would be a revelation for everyone else. A subtle reminder that power without accountability is nothing more than a temporary illusion. I reviewed every rule, every bylaw, every loophole, searching for cracks in her armor. Each one became a thread I could pull, a piece of the puzzle I could exploit. I reminded myself, patience would be as critical as precision. There was no need for haste. The longer this plan simmered, the more impactful it would be. Karen thrived on immediate compliance, on reactions fueled by emotion. By denying her that gratification, I already had the first advantage. And so I laid the foundation in my mind, quiet and deliberate like a chess player setting up the board, knowing each piece had its purpose, each move its consequence. This wasn't revenge, it was correction, a balance of scales she had tilted far too heavily in her favor. In that moment, staring at the blank walls of my living room, the plan crystallized. I would not just reclaim what was mine. I would expose the fragility of her dominion, layer by layer, until the whole facade came crashing down. Karen had sent me a warning in the form of a towed car. I intended to respond with one that she would never forget, and not out of anger or malice, but out of necessity, out of the principle that no one, not even an HOA president with a clipboard and a smirk, could wield unchecked authority over others. The night grew deeper, shadows stretching across my floor, and I welcomed them. They were my allies, silent witnesses to the planning, the scheming, the inevitable reckoning. I knew the road ahead would be long, perhaps messy, certainly uncomfortable for her, but for me, it was clear, precise, and necessary. And as I finally allowed my eyes to close, the thought that lingered, sharp and unwavering, was that sometimes the quietest storms are the ones that cause the most destruction. And Karen, in all her arrogance, was about to witness that truth firsthand. I spent the next few days documenting everything, moving with the quiet precision of someone who had finally decided they'd had enough. Every morning before work, every evening after sunset, I walked the neighborhood with my phone in hand, pretending to take casual strolls while actually collecting proof, timestamps, photos, videos, audio clips, anything that captured the truth behind Karen's little empire. What started as a simple attempt to understand why my car had been towed quickly became something much deeper. I found myself noticing patterns I had previously ignored. The way she singled out certain residents, always the ones who questioned her authority. The strategically placed notices taped to doors at odd hours. the fines that contradicted the HOA handbook, the discrepancies between what she claimed and what the rules actually stated. It was almost astonishing how blatant some of it was, as if she believed she was untouchable. And perhaps, for a long time, she had been. But power built on intimidation is power built on sand, and I was beginning to see the cracks. One neighbor, Mr. Lawson, a quiet, retired man who barely spoke to anyone, told me in a hushed voice that Corinne had fined him for non-approved gardening modifications because he planted tulips instead of HOA-recommended flowers. Another neighbor, Sarah, confided that Corinne had threatened to suspend her voting rights after she questioned an unexplained increase in monthly dues. I realized quickly that people weren't just frustrated, they were afraid of her. Fear had built her authority, brick by brick, until no one dared speak up. But fear only works until someone decides to challenge it. That someone, I understood now, was me. I began organizing my evidence systematically. Digital folders named by categories, subfolders for dates, cross-referenced screenshots of HOA regulations next to Corinne's violations. Even at work during lunch breaks, I found myself scrolling through the files, piecing together timelines and inconsistencies. The deeper I went, the more disturbing the picture became. The financial records I accessed, public ones she clearly assumed no one would ever bother checking, were riddled with questionable transactions. Inflated maintenance charges, vague administrative fees, repair expenses paid to companies that didn't seem to exist. It was small-scale corruption, sure, but corruption nonetheless. And it wasn't just money. Corinne had been blocking resident complaints, deleting emails, and forwarding selective messages to the HOA board to manipulate outcomes. The board members, either too busy or too apathetic, rubber-stamped her decisions without ever looking beneath the surface. It wasn't hard to see why. Corinne monopolized every meeting, controlling the agenda, controlling the minutes, controlling the narrative. There were even rumors she had forced out the previous president through a smear campaign disguised as rule enforcement. The more I uncovered, the more my plan sharpened into something precise and razor-edged. This wasn't just about getting my car back anymore. It was about accountability, justice, and exposing the rot beneath the polished suburban facade she had crafted for herself. Every act of harassment I discovered fueled me further. I recorded an incident where she berated a single mother for having non-compliant trash bins, even though the bins were provided by the city itself. I filmed her measuring grass height on a neighbor's lawn with a ruler, citing violations that conveniently aligned with people who had voted against her in the last board election. I even caught her taking photos of a teenager's bike left on a driveway for less than 10 minutes, muttering something about these children needing discipline. It was breathtaking, really, the extent of pettiness her authority allowed. But the moment that solidified everything came when I discovered a string of emails between her and a local towing company, emails suggesting she was receiving kickbacks for every car removed from the neighborhood. That was the turning point, the final puzzle piece, the confirmation that this was not just ego, it was exploitation, and she had been pocketing the rewards. My anger cooled into resolve. Not the fiery, reckless kind, but the focused, strategic kind that makes every step deliberate. I knew exactly what needed to be done. I began assembling a portfolio, a comprehensive dossier that would be impossible to ignore, evidence of financial misconduct, abuse of power, harassment, rule manipulation, and towing fraud. But I wasn't going to present it yet. Timing mattered. Precision mattered. I wanted Corinne to feel the same helplessness she had inflicted on the entire neighborhood for years, not through cruelty but through truth, cold, undeniable truth. I kept gathering more, refining every detail. I dug into old HOA meeting minutes, comparing them to residents' testimonies. I cross-referenced payment logs with bank statements pulled from public records. I interviewed neighbors discreetly, often under the pretense of casual conversation. People opened up once they realized someone was finally listening. And slowly, word spread, not publicly, but quietly, like a whisper of hope carried from one porch to another. He's collecting evidence. He's not afraid of her. Maybe someone will finally stand up to Corinne. But I said nothing. I made no promises. I simply continued working. Because if I was going to take down Corinne, really take her down, it had to be done flawlessly. One mistake, one premature move, and she would tighten her grip, retaliate harder, maybe even twist the narrative to portray me as the villain. No, she wouldn't get that chance. Not this time, not with me. So I documented. I exposed, I prepared. And every new piece of truth I uncovered became a weapon, not one of violence but of justice. A weapon she wouldn't see coming. A weapon she had unknowingly handed me through her own arrogance. The more evidence I gathered, the more confident I became. And slowly, methodically, I realized something powerful. Corinne wasn't as unstoppable as she pretended to be. She was simply loud. And soon, very soon, the neighborhood would see exactly who she really was. My plan wasn't just taking shape anymore. It was nearly complete. Corinne called a community meeting, as she often did, using the HOA's notice system not as a tool for discussion or cooperation, but as a stage for her own ego, a pulpit from which she could preach rules with an air of infallibility. And the moment I walked into the small community hall, I could feel the tension, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and barely suppressed resentment radiating from the neighbors who had suffered under her reign for years, and I took my seat near the back. Watching as she strutted to the front, clipboard in hand, voice sharp and commanding, each word meticulously designed to assert dominance, to remind everyone that she was in control and that dissent would not be tolerated. And she began, as expected, with a flourish of theatrics, highlighting the latest violations she had recorded, waving fines like trophies, pointing out each resident with exaggerated authority. And as she spoke, I could see the subtle signs of discomfort ripple through the room. Mrs. Donovan shifting in her seat, Mr. Lawson gripping the edge of the table, Sarah's fingers tightening around her coffee cup. But Corinne was oblivious to the subtle but growing currents of unease, so consumed with her own performance that she failed to notice how her words, meant to instill fear, were instead fueling a silent, collective awareness that perhaps her power wasn't as absolute as she believed. And then came the moment that set the tone for everything to follow. She mentioned me, my name punctuated with disdain, as she accused me of challenging community standards, of supposedly refusing to comply with arbitrary rules, and I could see the room react, glances exchanged between neighbors, eyes widening, subtle nods, a recognition that finally someone had stood up, that someone had the courage to question the rules that had been enforced selectively, unfairly, and with intimidation as the primary weapon. And I kept my calm, smiled slightly, a small, controlled motion that carried more weight than anger, more consequence than confrontation, because I knew something Corinne did not. The streets, the trust deeds, the properties, the hidden leverage she had never considered, all had quietly shifted in my favor, and she was blissfully unaware that her little performance was about to meet an unmovable reality, one that would not respond to bluster, intimidation, or threats, but to calculated, undeniable authority she had ignored because she assumed she alone held it. And as she continued, belittling neighbors who dared to ask questions, waving her gavel-like hand to punctuate her points, I allowed her to speak uninterrupted, gathering her words, her gestures, her misstatements, and nodding every micro-expression, every slight misstep that revealed overconfidence, arrogance, or weakness. Because this meeting wasn't about reacting. It was about observing, absorbing, and preparing for the moment when the scales would tip. And as Corinne turned to a particularly vulnerable neighbor, lecturing them about fines for non-compliant landscaping that didn't exist, the murmurs started, low and almost imperceptible at first. A whisper of resistance carried from one side of the room to the other, subtle shifts in posture, a collective realization that perhaps the intimidation was not invincible, and that the enforcement of rules had been capricious, selective, and self-serving. And while Corinne prattled on, I began my internal countdown, visualizing the first domino falling. The initial move that would make her feel the tremor she had never anticipated, and when she finally paused for effect, expecting applause or nods of agreement, she was met instead with polite but tense silence, the kind of silence that carries weight, that makes the loudest voices hesitate. and I let that moment stretch just enough to unsettle her, to inject a fraction of doubt into the fortress of certainty she had built around herself. And as she scanned the room, trying to gauge support, I subtly caught the glance of Mr. Lawson, a quiet nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell me that the network of awareness I had been building, the quiet accumulation of observation, evidence, and support, had begun to crystallize. And I realized then that this meeting, meant to assert her supremacy, was about to become the stage for the first subtle yet decisive counterstrike, executed not through confrontation, but through the leverage of knowledge and ownership that Karen had never considered. And so I waited, patient, calm, letting her words fill the air, letting her smug confidence inflate to its fullest, because the higher she climbed on the pedestal of perceived authority, the harder the fall would be when the foundation beneath her was quietly shifted, unseen but immovable. And then, as she gestured toward the exit, threatening more fines, more arbitrary enforcement, I rose slightly in my chair, smiling, meeting her gaze directly, a measured, confident expression that carried an unspoken message. The game had changed, and the first move had already been made, and when she finally left, basking in what she assumed was control, she did not notice the subtle, almost invisible markers I had placed, the contacts I had confirmed, the legal checks quietly initiated, all of which would converge in the coming days to make her realize too late that her reign over the streets, over the neighborhood, over the fragile illusion of absolute authority, had ended. And as I walked out behind her, neighbors now looking at me with a mix of curiosity, relief, and quiet hope, I understood that the power balance had shifted irrevocably, that the streets themselves, the network of properties and legal leverage I had assembled, would ensure that Karen's smirk, her theatrics, her intimidation, were no longer capable of maintaining control. And in that moment, I felt a cold but satisfying clarity. The first move was not about confrontation. It was about positioning, observation, and the patient deployment of invisible leverage. And Karen, in all her arrogance, had walked right into it, blissfully unaware that the neighborhood she thought she dominated was about to change forever. Not with a scream, not with violence, but with the quiet, unyielding power of preparation, knowledge, and inevitability. It happened before dawn, in the quiet stillness of a neighborhood that usually awoke slowly, the kind of morning where birds chirped lazily and streetlights flickered off one by one as the sun prepared to rise, when a massive, low rumble began to disturb the air, subtle at first, like the warning growl of something enormous approaching. And I watched from my window as a truck, unusually large and armored-looking, rolled onto the street, drawing curious, cautious glances from neighbors who pressed against blinds and peered through gaps in curtains, whispers traveling quietly from house to house as the oversized vehicle maneuvered into position directly in front of Karen's pristine, perfectly landscaped home, the one she had spent years using as her personal showcase of authority, a palace of rules and intimidation. And the truck's trailer doors slowly opened, revealing a monstrous 30-ton military tank, its metal body gleaming even in the muted early light, a symbol of power so absolute it seemed almost absurd. Yet in the stillness of the morning, there it was, parked deliberately, immovable, undeniable, as if gravity itself had chosen sides in the silent war of the neighborhood. And the street, normally the domain of lawnmowers, mail trucks, and the occasional bicycle, had transformed into a stage for confrontation, silent yet screaming with the presence of something unstoppable. And the neighbors, curious and incredulous, watched as the hum of engines settled into an almost eerie quiet, the tank standing like a sentinel, a contradiction to the delicate hedges and ornate gates that defined the suburban aesthetic. And I could almost hear Karen's smug inner monologue from the comfort of her own porch, thinking she had control, thinking she had seen everything, that no one could surprise her, that the world bent to the precise lines she drew and the fines she imposed, when finally she emerged. Hair perfectly styled, robe flowing slightly in the early breeze, coffee cup in hand, that same infuriating grin plastered across her face, the expression of someone who believed they were the center of the universe and that every event, Every movement was choreographed to validate their supremacy. And as she stepped fully onto the porch, eyes scanning the street, she froze, the coffee cup halting midair. Her smug grin faltering as her gaze fell upon the massive machine that now dominated the street before her house. A machine so out of place yet so deliberate, so unmistakably positioned, that even her mind, accustomed to controlling narratives, scrambled to process it, and the neighbors stifled gasps, whispers of disbelief spreading like wildfire through the community, as some pulled phones from pockets, cameras clicking to document what had to be seen to be believed, and Karen, who had once dictated the narrative of the neighborhood with the precision of a general issuing commands, now found herself confronted with a presence she could neither control nor ignore, a presence that dwarfed her carefully curated image of authority, her meticulously maintained lawns, her posted notices, and her fines, all of which suddenly seemed trivial and powerless in the face of the silent, immovable metal giant in front of her. And I, observing from a distance, allowed myself a small, controlled smile, knowing the culmination of weeks of careful planning, observation, and leverage had led to this moment, that the invisible threads I had been pulling quietly, invisibly, had positioned a first move that was unmistakable, undeniable, and more importantly, inescapable. And as Karen stepped forward, coffee trembling slightly in her hand, her eyes wide now, scanning the tank for some explanation, some justification, some way to assert control where there was none to be had. The neighborhood collectively held its breath, the streets silent except for the occasional hum of the massive engine, a hum that seemed to mock her, that seemed to say, "Power is an illusion when the foundation beneath you is not your own." And the tank, a historic display in paperwork but a monolithic presence in reality, blocked her driveway, blocked her street, and blocked the carefully constructed illusion that she could command anything she pleased. And I imagined the swirl of thoughts racing through her mind. Calls she could make, threats she could issue, fines she could impose, orders she could bark, but all of them impotent against the immovable steel that now declared its own authority, a silent reminder that some forces, once properly aligned, cannot be bargained with, cannot be bullied, cannot be intimidated. And as the first rays of sunlight struck the tank's surface, reflecting off the polished metal and casting shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawns, I realized that Karen's world, built on arbitrary rules and selective enforcement, had just been confronted with a reality she had not considered, a reality she could not bend to her will, a reality that the streets themselves, the very ground she had thought she controlled, now refused to obey. And as she finally set down her coffee, muttering under her breath, moving closer with tentative, incredulous steps, I knew the ripple effect had begun, the moment that would be whispered about in neighbors' living rooms for weeks. The moment when Karen realized that power is only meaningful when recognized by those who see it. And today, recognition had shifted irrevocably, from her to the undeniable presence dominating her street, a presence she could neither move nor command, a presence that symbolized the culmination of patience, strategy, and quiet determination, a presence that made it abundantly clear. The streets were no longer hers to control, and the first tangible strike in this silent war had arrived, permanent, immovable, and unforgettable. The tank moved with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness, its massive treads crushing the asphalt slightly under its weight as it rolled forward, each motion accompanied by a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the street, the kind of sound that makes even the most confident person pause and reconsider their sense of control. And when it finally stopped, it did so diagonally across the road, a steel colossus whose size alone rendered Karen's car trapped behind it. Her driveway effectively turned into a cul-de-sac with no exit, a fact that quickly became apparent to everyone watching from their windows, blinds, and porches, and I could see the neighbors begin to stir, whispering to one another, some stepping outside for a better view, others craning their necks from second-floor windows, the collective realization dawning that what had arrived in front of Karen's house was not a joke, not a random delivery, not a mistake, but a meticulously calculated blockade. a physical manifestation of consequences they had all quietly hoped would happen to someone who had abused power for so long. And Karen herself was visibly shaken, her usual composure cracking as she stormed onto the lawn, coffee-forgotten robe flapping slightly in the morning breeze, arms flailing as she screamed, "Who did this? Call the authorities. Someone call the police. This is illegal. You can't just block a street like this." And she ran back and forth along her driveway, muttering frantic calculations about fines, insurance, towing, and legal complaints, a flurry of panic and disbelief. And yet as her voice echoed down the quiet street, none of the neighbors moved to intervene or support her, their silence a subtle rebellion, a tacit acknowledgement that for once, Karen's control had limits, that her theatrics had collided with a force she could neither intimidate nor manipulate. And I stayed inside, behind the safety of my living room window, pretending ignorance, my hands folded calmly as I watched her futile efforts, suppressing a laugh that threatened to escape every time she attempted to maneuver her car, only to realize the massive tank blocked every conceivable exit. And her anger escalated, the shrill tone of her voice cutting through the morning air. But it carried no power anymore, only desperation, frustration, and the realization that her perfectly ordered world was now in disarray. All of it thanks to a plan executed with patience, observation, and meticulous timing. And as she shouted into her phone, presumably demanding law enforcement to remove the obstacle, I imagined the internal scramble of thoughts that must have raced through her mind. Every possible scenario she had relied on to maintain control rendered impossible by the sheer presence of steel, treads, and weight. And I could see the subtle ways her posture changed, shoulders tightening, jaw clenching, movements growing erratic as the illusion of dominance she had so carefully maintained for years slipped further and further from her grasp. And the whispers among the neighbors grew louder, hesitant voices carrying across the cul-de-sac, as some of them ventured onto their lawns, a few pretending to jog past the scene while secretly observing, and the realization spread. This wasn't just a tank, it was a statement, an undeniable declaration that Karen's power was not infinite, that the very streets she thought she commanded were now arenas of observation and accountability. And as she attempted once again to move her car, banging against invisible barriers of asphalt and steel, her cries for help bouncing off empty streets, I allowed myself a small, victorious smirk, appreciating the poetic justice of the moment. The irony of someone so obsessed with control now rendered powerless by a silent, immovable force. And as she began packing back and forth, muttering legal threats, dialing numbers, gesturing wildly to neighbors who avoided eye contact, I realized that patience had done its work. The first shock was administered, the streets had spoken, and the blockade was no longer just physical but psychological. An assertion that the rules she had wielded to intimidate others no longer applied when the tables were turned, and the morning sun glinted off the tank's polished steel, reflecting both light and inevitability back at her, a silent mirror to show her the futility of her tantrums, the impossibility of revering what had been carefully orchestrated. And I stayed calm, pretending to sip coffee, a master of invisibility, knowing that the real impact of the blockade was not the physical impossibility it created, but the domino effect it would have in her mind, the creeping dread that her authority was not absolute, that her reign over the neighborhood had cracks now wide enough to be seen. And as she finally slumped against the hood of her car, arms crossed, glaring at the tank like it had personally insulted her, neighbors quietly emerging from their homes to witness the spectacle, some holding back chuckles, others shaking their heads in disbelief, I understood that the first move had done more than I anticipated. It had shifted the energy of the street, redistributed courage, and made a silent declaration that the days of Karen's unchecked power were numbered. And though she screamed, called the authorities, and plotted furious retaliations from behind the confines of her own property, the truth was undeniable. The blockade was complete. The streets had changed, and the neighborhood, whether they admitted it aloud or only whispered in private, had begun to see the truth of what happens when arrogance meets preparation, patience, and a plan executed with quiet, unyielding precision. And as I watched Corinne finally retreat inside her home, slamming the door behind her, I allowed myself a small laugh. The sound muffled but satisfying, knowing that the stage was set, the first psychological victory claimed. And the weeks to come would only deepen the unraveling of her false supremacy, brick by brick, rule by rule, until the tank, the blockade, and the quiet patience that created them became the symbol of the end of Corinne's illusion of absolute control. Corinne's panic was immediate and visceral, a stark contrast to the composed, authoritative persona she had cultivated for years. As she stormed from her front porch to the street, phone pressed to her ear, fingers trembling as she dialed the local police department, demanding, insisting, and screaming that some illegal obstruction had been placed in front of her home, all the while waving her arms frantically toward the massive steel tank that now occupied the street, its sheer presence dominating the neighborhood, and her neighbors, peering cautiously from behind closed blinds and partially drawn curtains, watched the unraveling spectacle with a mixture of shock, amusement, and growing relief. Because finally, the woman who had spent years wielding fear and intimidation as tools of control was exposed to a force she could neither manipulate nor command. And as she barked at the dispatcher, recounting her grievances with a tone somewhere between hysteria and fury, the officers, polite yet firm, explained that they were legally unable to remove the tank without a warrant, citing municipal codes and property regulations, because despite her outrage, technically, the tank was parked on the street under a valid permit labeled as a local historic display. A detail that, had she read carefully, might have prevented some of her self-inflicted embarrassment. But Corinne's world had never been about legality or nuance. It had been about intimidation, selective enforcement, and the assumption that her will was absolute. And now, confronted with rules and regulations she had ignored for years, she found herself impotent, shouting at officers who politely repeated their limitations, as if the sound of her voice could somehow bend reality to her desires, and the neighbors could hear every word, whispers spreading quickly from house to house, the collective energy of the street shifting from fear to quiet empowerment, because for once, they were witnessing not a tyrant enforcing rules arbitrarily, but a person fully exposed to the limitations of her authority, a moment of poetic justice played out against the backdrop of asphalt, hedges, and the gleaming steel of a 30-ton immovable object. And Corinne, realizing the police could do nothing, began to escalate her threats in every direction, vowing to sue, threatening fines, accusing the delivery company of conspiracy, and gesturing wildly toward anyone within view. But all of it fell flat against the concrete certainty of the blockade, the tank's presence an immovable statement that no amount of screaming, legal threats, or emotional manipulation could overturn. And as she pivoted, scanning the street for allies, she found none willing to openly support her. The subtle yet growing defiance in the neighbors' eyes impossible to ignore, some crossing their arms, others simply shaking their heads, all silently acknowledging that for the first time, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. And the irony of the situation was not lost on me as I observed from the safety of my home, sipping coffee, calm and deliberate, knowing that every action she had taken over the past weeks to consolidate power, intimidate others, and assert control had now been rendered irrelevant, undermined by preparation, timing, and the quiet patience of planning. And as Corinne tried to manipulate, to plead, to demand, and to threaten, it became painfully clear to her that control was not something one could impose solely through volume, ego, or selective enforcement of rules, because true authority is granted by recognition, by compliance, and by the consent of those being governed. And in this street, that consent had silently evaporated, replaced by a mixture of amusement, relief, and the dawning realization that Corinne's reign was over. And her panic deepened as she attempted one last desperate tactic. Calling a private towing service, thinking perhaps a contractor would dare defy legality in favor of her anger. But even the company representatives, knowing the tank's permit and the legalities surrounding it, refused, their polite refusals ringing louder in her ears than any compliance ever had. And at that moment, the magnitude of her loss of control hit her fully, as the carefully constructed image of dominance, intimidation, and unquestionable authority crumbled before the street, before her neighbors, and before the impossible steel monolith that now defined her access, or rather lack thereof. And she staggered back, coffee forgotten, robes slightly disheveled, face pale, lips trembling as she realized that all her years of meticulous enforcement, her fines, her threats, her carefully maintained image of perfection, were powerless against a plan executed with precision, patience, and absolute understanding of leverage. And as she muttered frantically to herself, packing the lawn and gesturing at the tank as if sheer will could move it, whispers of admiration and restrained laughter began circulating among neighbors, some venturing to peek from windows, others cautiously stepping outside, yet none approaching directly, all respecting the unfolding reality that Corinne's panic had become the neighborhood's spectacle, the streets themselves taking on a symbolic role, showing that power is not absolute when applied without fairness, without accountability, without consideration of consequences. And as I watched, a subtle smile forming, I understood that the first psychological victory had been achieved. Corinne's sense of control, that which she had wielded like a weapon for years, had not merely slipped, it had evaporated, replaced by helplessness, fury, and the creeping, undeniable acknowledgement that the streets were no longer hers, that the neighborhood no longer obeyed her commands, and that every move she had made to assert dominance was now visible to everyone as nothing more than desperation, a stark contrast to the quiet, deliberate strategy that had orchestrated this outcome. And in that moment, standing in my window, observing the unraveling chaos of a woman who had once terrified an entire street with a smile and a clipboard, I realized that patience, preparation, and understanding of true leverage had achieved what yelling, intimidation, and arbitrary rules never could. A complete reversal of control, a lesson in power and humility played out in steel, asphalt, and the quiet, satisfied awareness that the streets were no longer hers to command. And as Corinne continued her frantic packing, muttering threats she could not enforce and imagining legal battles she could not win, the weight of inevitability settled over her, the neighborhood, and the massive tank, a triumphant silence descending over the cul-de-sac, a quiet proof that sometimes the smallest, most deliberate actions can topple even the loudest, most arrogant of reigns. And that morning, the streets themselves had spoken with the clarity of immovable metal. And Corinne, screaming into a phone that could not save her, realized she had lost far more than access. She had lost authority, perception, and the unchallenged dominion she had once assumed was hers forever. A few days after the tank had permanently established its presence in front of Corinne's house, and after her panicked calls, furious packing, and escalating threats had failed to produce any results, I decided it was time to deliver a subtle but undeniable message, one that required no physical force, no confrontation, only the quiet, almost poetic authority of implication, and I carefully drafted an anonymous letter. Each word chosen deliberately to cut through her arrogance and make her confront the reality she had been ignoring for years, the reality that power is meaningless without fairness, that intimidation loses its grip when confronted with patience, preparation, and moral clarity. And the letter read simply, "Rules are fine, but common sense is better. Treat people fairly, or the streets will remind you who really controls them." But the simplicity of the message belied the depth of its impact, because it carried with it the weight of invisible observation, meticulous planning, and undeniable truth. And I knew she would read it, perhaps trembling, perhaps furious, and yet unable to retaliate, unable to confront the source. Because the entire neighborhood had already begun quietly aligning with the invisible shift in power that had taken place over the past week. And as I slipped the envelope under her door in the early morning, ensuring no witnesses, no trace, I imagined the moment she would discover it. The crisp paper, the bold but elegant handwriting, the brevity of the warning, and the fact that it came without threat of physical retaliation, only moral and psychological consequence, and I knew that was what would sting the most, because Karen, for all her years of wielding fines, intimidation, and arbitrary enforcement, had never been confronted with a subtle, undeniable display of accountability, one that relied entirely on observation, truth, and strategy rather than volume or bluster. And when she eventually opened the letter, probably mid-morning with her coffee in hand, I pictured her frown deepening as she read, reread, and perhaps even held it up to examine the handwriting, wondering if any neighbor had dared to cross her, if the HOA board had orchestrated some secret move, if the city itself had intervened. And in that moment, I imagined the smallest seeds of doubt planting themselves in her mind, tiny but persistent, growing with each thought. Each glance at the streets she had thought were under her control, at the neighbors who now moved freely without fear, who whispered quietly in hallways and across fences, who smiled subtly as she paced back and forth in her own yard, muttering to herself, trying to reclaim authority that had evaporated. And the genius of the letter, if one could call it that, was its refusal to provide a target for retaliation, its refusal to offer a villain, because it wasn't about punishment, it was about truth. And truth is a weapon even the most confident bully cannot defend against, and the letter was more than words. It was the embodiment of the invisible network I had quietly built. The neighbors who observed, the research I had conducted, the legal leverage I had confirmed, the patience I had exercised, all converging in a single, elegant statement that reminded Karen she no longer commanded the streets she had ruled with fear, and the neighborhood, for its part, was quietly cheering, not openly, but in the way of those who recognize justice quietly done, in smiles exchanged behind curtains, nods from porches, in conversations that started with, "Have you noticed?" and ended with subtle acknowledgement that Karen, for the first time in years, had been forced to feel powerless, had been forced to confront the limits of her dominion. And the beauty of it was that it was entirely nonviolent, entirely strategic, and entirely irreversible. Because once the realization hits that authority built on fear can be undone by preparation and observation, that knowledge spreads faster than threats ever could. And Karen, in her panic, would see every small action she had taken over the years reframed through the lens of her current impotence, understanding for the first time what it feels like to be at the mercy of circumstances she cannot control, and perhaps even, if she were honest with herself, recognizing that the streets themselves had become a force she could not intimidate, a force that silently reminded her that arrogance is fragile, and power without accountability is nothing more than an illusion. And I, observing from my vantage point, felt a quiet satisfaction, a deep, patient pleasure in knowing that the letter had done its work, that it had delivered both clarity and consequence without raising my voice, without confrontation, without the need for any spectacle beyond the truth laid bare in ink on paper. And as Karen held the letter in her hands, muttering under her breath, packing, rereading, shaking, and perhaps even imagining every neighbor's silent laughter, I understood that the shift was complete. The streets were no longer hers, her authority evaporated, her reign of fear dismantled, and the neighborhood once shackled by compliance and intimidation, now breathed freely, united not by confrontation, but by the quiet, unstoppable power of truth, observation, and preparation. And in that moment I realized that this chapter of the neighborhood's history, written with patience, steel, and ink, was not just about Karen's downfall, but about the subtle, undeniable assertion that fairness, accountability, and strategy can move mountains, or in this case, tanks, and that the letter, anonymous yet powerful, would echo in her mind for weeks, maybe months, a reminder that the streets, the neighbors, and the careful orchestration of justice would always hold the final say. The morning the local news caught wind of the absurd situation, it was as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its collective breath, waiting for some form of external validation that what we had all witnessed, Karen's frantic panic, the tank blocking her driveway, her futile calls to authorities, was not just amusing but undeniable. And when the headline flashed across screens, loud and unapologetic, HOA Karen blocked by 30-ton tank, There was an almost audible ripple of relief and laughter spreading from house to house, from street to street, a kind of vindication that had nothing to do with legal action or fines, but with the sheer spectacle of poetic justice that everyone, from retirees peering through blinds to teenagers filming from balconies, could witness and appreciate. And the video footage, captured by a neighbor's discreet camera, showed everything. Karen storming back and forth on her lawn, waving her hands, shouting into her phone futile gestures toward the massive steel tank that dwarfed her carefully manicured driveway, every twitch and flinch amplified by the wide-angle lens that captured the absurdity in perfect detail. And as the footage went online, reposted and shared on social media, every comment section was filled with a mix of incredulity, laughter, and subtle moral triumph. People marveling at how a woman so obsessed with control and intimidation could be rendered completely powerless by a combination of patience, strategy, and a little bit of theatrical irony. And Karen, of course, tried to spin it desperately, furiously, claiming the video was a hoax, an elaborate prank, that the tank was somehow staged or illegally placed, but the evidence was everywhere. Timestamps, neighbor testimonials, photographs, and the undeniable presence of the tank itself, gleaming in the morning sunlight, parked diagonally across the street with its treads embedded into the asphalt, a silent monolith of humiliation. And as the story went viral, local news stations picked it up, adding commentary that ranged from bemusement to incredulous reporting, highlighting how a person who had spent years asserting authority over neighbors through intimidation and petty enforcement was now the subject of national ridicule, a lesson in the fragility of unchecked power. And the neighbors, who had suffered quietly under Karen's reign for years, began to emerge from their homes, some still in pajamas, others with coffee in hand, all laughing quietly or exchanging knowing glances. A community moment that had nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with shared relief and the recognition of justice delivered in the most unexpected, absurd, and satisfying way. And as Karen paced on her lawn, muttering into her phone, gesturing wildly toward anyone who might validate her claims, she realized that no amount of explanation, no lawyer, no phone call could undo the viral humiliation that had enveloped her reputation. The footage traveling far beyond the cul-de-sac, landing in comment sections, news segments, and even national talk shows, where people marveled at the audacity of a single resident orchestrating a response so imaginative and precise that it had rendered a powerful HOA president powerless without lifting a hand in violence. And as her frantic attempts to regain composure failed, neighbors began to record their own clips, sharing them online, subtly reinforcing the narrative that her reign had ended. And Karen's screams of indignation only served to increase the amusement, creating a feedback loop of public mockery that she could neither control nor escape. And the realization sank in slowly, painfully, that her carefully maintained image of authority, her fines, her threats, her meticulous enforcement of arbitrary rules, were all meaningless against the combination of visibility, documentation, and the strategic patience of a plan executed flawlessly. And the tank, still immovable, still gleaming, became more than just a physical blockade. It was a symbol of inevitable accountability, a reminder that no amount of ego, intimidation, or theatrics could overcome preparation, observation, and deliberate action. And as social media exploded with memes, captions, and reposts, Karen's face, gritted, frustrated, pale, and utterly helpless, was forever associated with the word humiliation in digital memory, the culmination of years of unchecked power reduced to absurdity by a single, quiet, invisible force. And in the quiet aftermath, neighbors could finally walk their streets without fear of arbitrary fines or intimidation, sharing subtle winks, hushed laughter, and the occasional sarcastic comment about how Karen should have checked her driveway rules before calling the cops. And as I watched from my window, a sense of satisfaction settled over me, not in malice, but in acknowledgement that justice had been served with precision, patience, and creativity. A reminder that control is never absolute and that arrogance, no matter how meticulously maintained, can be undone by strategy and awareness. And Karen, for the first time in years, had experienced what it meant to be powerless, to be publicly humiliated in a way that could not be ignored, dismissed, or appealed. Her reign of terror ended not through lawsuits, not through confrontations, not through fines or threats, but through sheer ridiculousness, through the quiet, deliberate orchestration of a plan that leveraged legality, patience, and social perception into undeniable victory. And the neighborhood, witnessing her downfall, was quietly united in the shared acknowledgement that sometimes the most effective way to end tyranny is not through force, but through clever, precise, and unavoidable consequences. And as Karen finally retreated inside, slamming the door behind her, muttering threats that no one could take seriously, the street erupted into hushed, celebratory murmurs, a subtle chorus of relief, amusement, and recognition that the absurdity of the moment had perfectly mirrored the absurdity of her previous actions. And the tank remained, a permanent reminder, a monument of poetic justice that the entire neighborhood, and now the world online, could witness, laugh at, and remember as the day HOA Karen once feared became a symbol of the fragility of unchecked power, her legacy of intimidation replaced by a cautionary tale of hubris, patience, and the transformative power of observation, planning, and undeniable evidence. And in that quiet triumph, the street itself seemed to sigh in relief, free at last from arbitrary authority. As the tank, the viral videos, and Karen's own reaction converged into a perfect lesson that some victories are sweetest not when shouted, but when witnessed, shared, and recognized universally, a public humiliation that could never be erased, ignored, or refuted. A complete and irreversible collapse of her carefully maintained illusion of control. The tank was eventually removed, and Karen quietly resigned from the HOA. The neighborhood returned to peace. I retrieved my car, unharmed, and realized, sometimes justice doesn't need anger, sometimes it needs imagination. And as for Karen, she would think twice before trying to tow anyone again.